This week, it's Virtual Hacker Summer Camp, and we have two interviews. First, we welcome Matt Ashburn. He's the Federal Engagement Lead at Authenticate to discuss how security spending overlooks the biggest risk of all. Then we welcome Doug Hubbard. He's the founder at Hubbard Decision Research. He's going to discuss the failure of risk management. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Most breaches are caused by exploiting oversights in basic cybersecurity fundamentals, but complex hybrid multi-cloud infrastructures make cybersecurity hygiene challenging. Red Seal can help. It shows you what's on your network, how it's connected, and the associated risk across public cloud, private cloud, and physical environments. With Red Seal, you'll get control of your cybersecurity fundamentals so you can protect your organization from the inevitable attack vectors and reduce your cyber risk. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/Red Seal. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 183. It's recorded on August 4th, 2020. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Finally back in studio. Oh, it's so good to be here. Joining me here in studio today is Mr. Paul Asadorian.
Hey, it's good to be here, Matt. Good to have you in studio.
Oh, it's been so long. It's been 6 months.
Martinis?
And we I've been kind of reserving these special martinis for when I got back here. Plus, we got the cigars today, so it's a special treat for me. Join the Security Weekly mailing list for webcasts and virtual training announcements and to receive your personal invite to our Discord server by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and click the button to join the list. Also, do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and complete the form. We will review them actually next week because this week's a little busy. Normally we do them at the beginning of the month. Our guest this segment, Matt Ashburn, is the Federal Engagement Lead at Authenticate, focusing on engagement with national security customers. Prior to Authenticate, Matt served as a CIA officer focusing on cyber issues, including a detail serving on the National Security Council as a Chief Information Security Officer and Special Advisor to the National Security Advisor, leading technical expertise, risk reduction strategies, and policy for national security systems. Matt, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Hey, Matt, how are you? Good to be here.
Yeah, we have two Matts on the show. We're both Matt A's, so folks, keep up with us. We'll try to keep it straight. We're going to talk today about one of the biggest risks that we don't necessarily see a lot of spending on in the security market. So first, kind of give us the primer on, what are we spending money on and what aren't we spending money on?
That's great. Yeah, Matt, it's kind of simple in hindsight when you think about it, right? But we spend upwards of $200 billion a year now in cyber defense. That's a crazy, crazy amount of money globally. Also, the cost of offensive cyber breaches and cyber operations against commercial businesses, financial institutions, and governments, they're totaling over $100 billion a year. So we're spending just a little bit more on defense than we are in the cost of the offense. And when it turns out that you look at this stuff, it looks like the common thread here is actually the browser. When you think about a malware attack, if you think about like the APT style attack, so Russia, China, you have North Korea even, these types of attacks that you see in the news, and probably 95% of a SOC, their time is spent looking after these really advanced attacks and worrying about these things and ransomware. How does all of that happen? We've invested all this money in all these security appliances, yet somehow the adversaries are still successful and very, very successful, in fact, because the cost keeps going up and up and up every year. turns out the common thread here is the browser, right? So the way a web browser works is you have a user, they access the local web browser, whether it's Firefox or Chrome or Microsoft Edge or some other kind of custom browser. The user requests a URL. The web browser goes out to the internet, grabs web content from an untrusted third party that you don't know. It goes through your entire security stack, brings that web content into your environment, executes it, renders it on the screen, interprets it, all there on the workstation. Well, that workstation also has access to all of your sensitive data and everything else in your network, right? So that can cause a lot of problems. And as we have seen in the past, lots of data compromises and data breaches are the result of this, right?
Yeah, I had Richard Steinen on earlier today for a micro-segment interview as part of Virtual Hacker Summer Camp. He's at IT Harvest. He's been tracking the markets for 10 years. He was frustrated at Gartner and did his own thing. And we were talking today about which markets are, growing above the average, which ones are down. He thinks the market's actually much bigger because he's done his bottom-up analysis. But it was funny. He called out today. He said, "Look, the firewall and the VPN markets, they're done, right?"
He's like the Grim Reaper of all things security. He just loves declaring things dead.
He does,
but he's usually right.
Yeah, and he calls out the firewall and the VPN, and you were just talking about it, right?
Totally, yeah.
We have all these perimeter defenses, but yet these attacks are still getting through because they're coming through the browser, not necessarily through the actual perimeter.
Right. Yeah. So I have here an animation that shows sort of the typical cyber attack, right? This is very generic, but you have the adversary on the outside on the untrusted internet. And then inside you have the organization's internal network with all of your workstations, users, sensitive data, all the things you don't want the outside people to get. And we've built the security perimeter over the years. We've invested heavily in firewalls, IDS, IPS, malware detonation, this entire security stack that we're all very familiar with and that we all have had to deal with in our experience. An adversary can blow right through that, right? And we know this because they send a malicious email, and it gets to the user. User clicks the link or clicks an attachment. It opens the browser, goes out to a website, grabs malicious code in some way, pulls that down, and it's then interpreted by the browser, right? That's inside your internal network, exploits some kind of vulnerability, gives malware back to the adversary, reaching back out, and then they can move laterally wherever they want. And we've seen in studies that advanced adversaries these days can compromise an entire network, have full control over your domain in less than 24 hours. That's terrifying. And these are very admirable organizations that have invested heavily over the years in a very well-defined security stack, but the adversaries are still successful. So the question is, well, knowing that this is the TTP that's existed for the past 17 or so years, this has not changed. Like, this architecture of an attack has not changed. And the one thing that has remained the same, despite all the security investment there in the middle, is really the browser. We're still using a browser that's installed on the workstation, that is touching the user, that is touching all the data that we care about on the inside, but also has access out to the websites that the adversaries control.
Yeah, I mean, the browser has become a very important component of kind of the triad I talk about, right? I talk about app user data, right? These browsers are being used to access applications, whether they're on-prem or in the cloud. You have identity and authentication there, and they have access to the data. And that browser plays a very interesting role in that architecture right now because it is on the local machine. It has access to you as a user and potentially data that is either on your machine or you're connected to. So how do you disconnect the browser from the endpoint?
Well, it's easy. You just don't let people go to websites.
Oh, yeah, that's easy. Oh,
that's my strategy at home. And it's interesting. Like, my kids do a lot of things on the computer, mostly gaming, right? And that's usually fine because I can set up the gaming stuff, and they have access to their email, and they're good about like not clicking on stuff in email, right? Because they know that like every email you get is probably someone lying to you, and like they get that, right? But where they get themselves into trouble the most is when they go out and start browsing the web. They want add-ons for their games, and they want screensavers and backgrounds, and that has just such a high probability in the home environment of, or even in any environment, of infecting your machine. And being at home and not in an enterprise, right? Like I don't have a security budget necessarily like for software at home, like most of us don't, we do for the enterprise. But at home, I use this filtering technology, And it's actually for like monitoring your kids kind of thing, but it has some features like if it doesn't know about a website, like don't let them visit it. And you can also block categories. And so like that has single-handedly been the number one thing that has prevented, my kids from destroying the Windows computer at home and forcing me to rebuild it again. Right? And it's been good for a while. And Matt, I think you can really speak to that in having enterprise technology that accomplishes the same goals essentially, right?
That's right. Yeah. So, there are a lot of ways you can tackle this, and we have a whole security stack. Like I said, if you have web filtering, you have the traditional AV stuff, firewalls, IPS, IDS, all the advanced stuff that you have today, next gen, everything, right? And there's no shortage of vendors that are happy to sell you whatever solution that they guarantee will stop everything. And we all know that's not true, right? We all have experience here that say it's not true. The one thing, again, that remains is that browser downloading untrusted content, interpreting it on the local workstation. So what if we just remove the browser at all? And it sounds crazy. Like, what if the browser wasn't located inside of our network with all the sensitive data?
That's not crazy at all. Because at home, I'd love to get rid of the browser and put it somewhere else. Because like I said, that's the number one attack vector, both at home and at work, right?
Exactly, yeah. And even if the adversaries, of course, you have drive-by downloads, ransomware, all sort of the internet junk and internet noise that's out there, the general internet badness. But you also have targeted attacks, right, that may exploit a vulnerability in, let's say, an email client, right, or another application like Microsoft Word or Excel. All that malicious code is still downloaded to the local workstation through the browser. Like, that's the common link that everybody keeps forgetting about. So if we switch, the architecture around a little bit and move the browser from inside the internal security perimeter and move it to the outside, right, and we have a cloud-based browser, then that solves a lot of problems, right? So that's what we've done at Authenticate with our Silo browser. It looks and feels just like a regular web browser. In fact, it's actually based on a fork of a very popular web browser, and it's great stuff, right? So we have it running inside of a secure virtualized container in the cloud. The user sees a live video stream of that session, almost like an RDP session, right? Where you see a remote video stream, and then the only thing that goes out to the internet are those user inputs, right? So this really narrows your attack vector significantly. So your users can still access everything that's on the internet. They can access the same look and feel, same user interface, view everything they need to view. But all that malicious content, or potentially malicious content, that untrusted content, never makes it inside of your security perimeter. It all stays on the outside. So even if an adversary or malware tries to compromise that browser, and even if they're successful, it stays within that virtualized container.
Yeah, we were talking yesterday on Application Security Weekly about like ultimate isolation, right? And we were talking about, ultimate isolation to me is like a Lambda function that runs in its own isolated virtual machine, so you can never cross-contaminate. You're doing the same kind of concept here, is that the browser's running in its own basic virtual machine, isolated from everything else, including the local endpoint, which means I can't really infect anything from there, can I?
Exactly. And the other thing that you get here is that the browser is moving from, in this case, a legacy type of application whose architecture hasn't really changed in 30 years. The web browser was created 30 years ago, and the architecture has been the same. And you can't really fix those protocols. You can't fix the architecture. So you really have to look at a replacement for that, right? And so a modern architecture for web browsing looks something like this, right? Where we have the browser sitting outside of our security perimeter, and we have very well-defined communication protocols that are allowed. So you can basically whitelist anything going out to the internet, limit that down to the silo servers, for example, and then you can start looking for other things, right? So this really gives you a lot of time back with your SOC. I spent most of my career standing up SOCs or working in SOCs in the federal space and commercial space. And I tell you, we would spend probably 90 to 95% of our day on just general badness on the internet. So when I'm saying general badness, I mean, the drive-by downloads, the random phishing that you get, sort of the unsophisticated phishing, but as well as the nation-state level attacks, the advanced persistent threat type of attacks that are very targeted. Those are pretty bad, and they all are from the web, right? They all have that thing in common where they all exploit the web browser architecture in some way.
Now, I equate this a little bit to what the WAF did for the application, right? I mean, you're abstracting that concept of a web application firewall almost one additional level at the browser level. But when I abstract the browser away, what other value do I get at that abstracted browser layer now that I couldn't get maybe before in my old kind of traditional security tools?
That's a great question. So one of the things you get, right, you get a lot of things here, but the big thing is that you have better insight into what your users are doing because you have better control over the browser. And it becomes, instead of a legacy, outdated, critical vulnerability, it now becomes an integrated enterprise application. And that's really the big shift that we've done here. Because look, there's no secret here as far as like virtualization or containers. People can do that on their own, right? But the benefit that we provide with our technology, and we have patents on this, by the way. This is our patented technology where we've integrated intense auditing of the user session, right? And by the way, you can encrypt that with a customer supplied key, so that we have full integrity, and also the data is secure, and it's also very private as well, right? So you have full insight into what your users are doing online, and it's a unified audit trail across anything that happens in the web browser, which is something that your traditional browsers just can't give you because it's outdated technology, outdated architecture.
Well, Matt, I think, sorry to interrupt, the one thing that's burning on my mind based on what Matt is asking is that, in a WAF scenario or with some of the other ways that I would try and protect users' browsing habits, basically relied on regular expressions or filtering, right? A WAF, traditional WAFs rely on regular expressions to filter what's coming into the web application. If you do proxying or filtering on your firewall or like DNS or whatever it is to protect, basically what you're saying, Matt, is those, browser sessions, that was more just regular expressions and filtering. What I love about the Authenticate technology is it doesn't rely on any of that, right? Because that's a losing battle to be able to try and filter out what's bad. It just is. But you're saying it doesn't matter whether it's bad, good, or indifferent. The user's getting a benign video stream, which is what I love about your slide.
That's exactly right. You no longer care what the user is doing from a security perspective, right? Like, you don't care if they visit a malicious website. And in fact, a lot of people that we have as customers, they use it to do security research. So they're doing cyber threat intelligence. They're intentionally going to malicious websites without any worry, right? They're on their corporate network and they're totally protected, right? They're isolated. The other thing that you get in addition to the detailed audit trail, because the architecture, you can customize the data loss prevention, right? So we have built-in features for things like copy-paste prevention. If you want users to be able to copy and paste to the clipboard, you can allow that, or you can disallow that. And you can, based on security groups and access controls, we have all that stuff. We also have DLP for printing and also for file upload download. If you want your users to be able to upload files to the internet or download files, you can enable that. But if you don't want that, you can also disable that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm thinking about, right? I'm thinking about things like data loss prevention, somebody uploading an Excel file somewhere because they're trying to exfiltrate data, right? There's a DLP use case. You've got the ability to do malware sandboxing and some things to make sure that malware never gets anywhere close to the machine. You get I assume you can still do your web filtering technology,
totally.
Whether you want it or not. But you start to add some additional capabilities now because you've got the browser in its own kind of isolated environment.
Well, it's off the user's machine.
Yeah, it's completely,
That's the key, right? It's off the user's machine. And that's the advantage over proxying or filtering technologies is it's not running on the user's machine, which is awesome.
That's exactly right. And you still get all the benefit, right, of the web filtering, because we have web filter. If you want to block certain categories of information, certain categories of sites, you can do all that, of course. You want to block URLs or IP addresses. If you want to do a block list, you can do that. The architecture, though, is the big shift, right? Because it gains so much from a security perspective and totally prohibits any kind of compromise of the workstation through the browser.
Well, it eliminates that game of whack-a-mole, right? Like, my son wanted to use Discord. And I was like, that's cool. Like, as long as I'm on your Discord server, that's cool. But then you start trying to whitelist. It's like, well, you don't need just discord.com. You need discordapp.com. And like without the other one, it sent me in this like endless like reCAPTCHA loop because they're using outdated reCAPTCHA technology. And so I'm like, I got to whitelist that one, right? And we've all been there. If you've done enterprise IT security, we've all played the game of whack-a-mole. And it's a losing game.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, back when I was a SOC analyst, that was incredibly frustrating, because you would spend 90% of your day focusing on the whack-a-mole game.
Yep.
And it's terrible. And even if you're a super bright analyst, you can get burnt out very, very quickly playing whack-a-mole. And so one of the things in SOCs that we all are familiar with is that SOCs typically have very high turnover because they get burnt out, right?
Yep.
Analysts get burnt out. You have a lot of attrition there because of that. And even some super bright analysts move on to another organization or another field because they get burnt out. They're tired of it, right? So your super bright analysts are leaving your SOC perhaps. Well, this is a way to recapture their time, right? So if you don't have to worry about the general internet badness that's out there, if you can eliminate that game of whack-a-mole, those bright analysts can now focus on things like insider threats or supply chain attacks and all the other things that might be in there. I ask people sometimes, hey, so when's the last time that your SOC was looking at DNS traffic, for example, right? And this is not something that's fictional. They're actually going back to, I guess, 2005 that I'm aware of, actual real-world nation-state level attacks that use DNS as an exfil mechanism. And I guarantee you most SOCs that are out there, certainly in the commercial space, aren't looking at DNS traffic, right? Because they don't have time. They're so focused on the web and the web-based threats.
But Matt, that's a great point. So, but the DNS traffic in this case, in the slide that you have up, right, that is happening outside my security perimeter, right?
Exactly,
Or where does the DNS request happen? Does it get proxy the DNS?
So in this case, if it's anything associated with the web browser, all of that is taking place outside of the security perimeter. Right?
Yeah, and that reduces my DNS logs, though.
Totally.
Right? Oh,
exactly.
that's awesome.
And so now you can actually look for things.
Yes.
So technically, you shouldn't really have too much, trying to reach out to the internet, right? If
That's really cool.
from inside the network, at least, right? But you're probably going to see some patching. You're probably going to see some operating
Applications,
system checks and things.
But it's
like
a lot
that.
more manageable once you take out. I mean,
Totally.
typically when I look at DNS, like you might do stuff like take out the Alexa top 1000 or
Exactly.
things like that, right? Because normal web browsing does a lot of DNS lookups and all that stuff, and even HTTP requests, right? You reduce that noise within your network. Now, like I would be able to pluck out like way faster the malicious attacks if you can come. You cut down your DNS and HTTP traffic down to probably by what 40%, 50% at least.
Oh, at least, yeah, probably more. At least, yeah.
Yeah, and you're also reducing a large part of the external attack surface because you've moved that browser outside, so that external kind of attack surface stays external. It's never coming into the network. I mean, that's a huge reduction in just the attack surface alone, just by moving that browser outside the perimeter.
Exactly.
Now, obviously, use cases here. I mean, end user use cases. I mean, any end user. Are there other use cases for this technology outside of what we would traditionally think about with standard browser usage?
That's a good question. So I mentioned the one earlier. So obviously, replacing your regular browser with this, right, is sort of the big one. But organizations that we've worked with have seen really great dividends by using it for things like cyber threat intel. So your SOC analysts, for example, need to view objectionable websites or malicious websites. Perhaps download files. By the way, we have cloud-based storage built in with the browser, so you can download files and then upload them to, for example, VirusTotal or your favorite sandbox, whatever that might be. Do analysis on the files, all without touching your corporate network or your organization's network. So cyber threat intel is a big one. We also see some adoption with secure remote access to applications. So right now, COVID obviously has changed things quite a bit in the world. A lot of people teleworking, working off-site that weren't before. You can use this if you flip it around. In the traditional use case, you have a trusted workstation reaching out to untrusted data with Silo there in the middle to protect it. However, what if you have trusted data, for example, a sensitive intranet website or a sensitive web application that you want to protect, but you have an untrusted end user device? So somebody's laptop at home, for example, maybe a BYOD type scenario. You don't have to worry about installing an agent on every single personal device the user is logging in from if they use Silo, right? Because they can log into the Silo site with their standard credentials. By the way, we integrate with AD, SAML, anything else you can think of, all the big authentication schemes. You can fully integrate it with your enterprise authentication. They log in, and then they have their untrusted device now reaching out and talking to a trusted data set or a trusted database or a web application. But you can control the data loss prevention controls there, right? So you can prohibit them, for example, from copying data from that web application and taking it to the clipboard and pasting it to their local machine. So there's a couple of examples there that you can use, and we've seen a lot of success there. A lot of folks looking at that for beefing up the security around their web applications.
Yeah, and I would imagine like a security researcher wanting to go out and do some research and not potentially, infecting their own machine could use this
I see it all the time,
right?
Oftentimes I'm remote and I'm on my phone. I'm like, I really want to see what's on the other side of that link, but there's no way in hell I'm clicking on that right now. Like, I got to wait till I get back into the lab and can, fire up a VPN or other such, technology. Matt, my question for you is, how do you, I hate to say force because that's not the right word, but like, how do you construct a policy so that users can't just like step outside of using the silo browser?
Good question. So there are a couple ways you can deploy this, right? One is an actual thick client browser that you install, much like Chrome, Firefox, or Edge. You just push that out through your group policy, right? And deploy it like you would any other application. But the downside to that is it requires the user to make a conscious effort there to open up the application to access the internet. And as we all know, you change anything in the IT stack, users are going to get uncomfortable. It's a different way of doing things. That can cause some friction, and especially in large organizations. We've all been there, I think. One thing that you can do, though, is actually using proxy files, so the PAC files that are popular with browsers, right, to actually direct any traffic that's normally going out to the internet, direct it to a special URL, basically rewriting the URL. You can also use, if you have a firewall that can do this, for example, or a web filter, web proxy, many ways you can do this, right? And you actually rewrite the URL because we have an in-tab browsing capability as well. So you actually can access this capability from within whatever your browser is today. So if you're using Chrome on desktops or if you're using Microsoft Edge, it will look and feel just like Microsoft Edge or Chrome to the users, but the tab that's opened up is actually a tab that is our application. It's a web application that's running, unbeknownst to the user, aside from the security controls that they may not have otherwise.
Interesting. Yeah.
And Edge is just Chrome now, actually.
Exactly. Yep.
Right. Which is an interesting move from Microsoft, which underscores the importance of browser security, right?
Yeah. But I mean, you got to make it frictionless for the user, right?
Exactly.
And you also don't want them to be able to try to bypass using the secure browser either, because it could open up a can of worms.
That's exactly right. You have to make this easy for the user and seamless, right? They should have no change in their process or their SOPs, right? Any kind of unfamiliarity, any kind of minimal change, as we all know, especially with large organizations, can really flood your help desk with a flood of calls and really have some negative feedback. So that's why we've worked very hard to make sure that if an organization wants to deploy this as a browser replacement, they can keep their browser there. And then we can work with them to install the appropriate proxy files or the appropriate rewrite rules or anything like that. Using your existing security infrastructure, right, you can still use that to direct the traffic out through Silo to make the connection secure and make sure that the user is just getting that video stream rather than the malicious content.
Right. Yeah, perfect. Any more questions for Matt?
Great stuff. I love this technology.
Yeah, I mean, this is great.
Every time we have someone on from Authenticate, I'm like, we really need this. I'm like, I need it at home. I need it where I need this technology.
Yeah. Matt, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Yeah, of course. Thank you guys very much. It's great to see you, and a big fan of the show.
Yeah, if you want to download a copy of the $1 Billion Security Blanket, please visit authenticate.com/BSW. We'll take a quick break and then welcome Doug Hubbard for a second interview.